Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. My guest today, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, is the United Nations Bureau Chief for South African Broadcast Corporation, SABC News. We have a wide-ranging discussion about happenings at the United Nations, including debates and discussions at the Security Council about the deteriorating situation in Libya, why the dispute in Western Sahara is at a key inflection point, how the ongoing Ebola outbreak in Congo is being discussed at the UN, and why the Trump administration's Middle East peace plan will likely shape debate and discussion at the UN this summer. This episode is the third installment of my series of chats with in-house UN correspondents about what's buzzing at Turtle Bay. The idea here is to touch base with a UN reporter about every 6 weeks or so to take the temperature around the UN and learn what issues are driving the agenda there. Let me know what you think of this series. You can send me an email using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. We kick off this installment of UN Correspondent Chat discussing the recent appearance before the Security Council of Hassan Salameh, the UN Secretary General's special envoy for Libya. So now here is my conversation with Sherwin Bryce-Pease of the South African Broadcast Corporation.
You know, just the tenor, Mark, of or his demeanor, if you will, was a man that was exhausted, a man that was gutted, who was very disappointed, who was sad to have to present the report to the council that he was presenting, because he was hoping to come and report back on a national dialogue and a peace conference that was, supposed to happen just as General Khalifa Haftar announced this sort of offensive against Tripoli, while we might add that the Secretary General was in the country basically to sort of wish the stakeholders well heading into the conference. So my sense of Hassan Salameh's demeanor and tone and his tenor was a man that had been very disappointed in the weeks leading up to that briefing by these new developments that I think, for all intents and purposes, given the trajectory that he was working on, were very unexpected. So Libya, he said in this briefing, is on the verge of descending into a fully fledged civil war again, which he said could lead to the permanent division of the country. He told the council about seeing the invitees to this national conference suddenly taking up arms. So that threw him into a deep level of sadness at the opportunity that was being forsaken, the opportunity that was being lost. He also talked about the security vacuum, and particularly in the south of the country, and the emergence, and this will be very concerning, I think, to all the members of the Security Council, the emergence of black ISIS flags in the south of the country. So as they're being kicked out of places like Syria and other parts of that region, they often talk about the security vacuum in the Sahel region, and this is why that region, if you look at Mali, for example, has become so insecure. So now we are seeing black flags in Libya, ISIS flags, that is.
So you mentioned the Security Council. Can you talk a little bit about the emerging Security Council dynamics here? I mean, I, for one, can't get a handle on who the U.S. is supporting or what the U.S. objectives are in Libya. I did a whole episode on sort of Haftar and the Libyan civil war, so I don't need to rehash all of that. But just to be brief, the U.S. sort of used to, or perhaps still does, support the UN-backed government there, but also simultaneously gave a wink and a nod to Haftar's offensive against Tripoli. Do you have a sense of, I guess, what the emerging council dynamics are?
I think you hit the nail on the head there, is that the sense whether you're talking about the press corps, I think diplomats here, is that we're all a little bit confused by it all, right? Because there is this UN-backed government. The Secretary General certainly would have relied on traditional allies, or certainly the P5, to support him and back his special representative. That's certainly the rhetoric you hear in the statements, is that we support the work that he's trying to do, Hassan Salame, and to bring parties together. But then you get these sort of, shooting from the hip statements that President Trump had a call with Haftar and basically supports his fight against terrorism in the country. So it does get a bit confusing. There's also a narrative around this where France perhaps wasn't as allied to the British position. Remember, it was the British. The British are the penholders on Libya, and they were trying to push a resolution that would call for an immediate ceasefire, an immediate a stop to the fighting, and allow humanitarian aid in, and it didn't seem to have the full backing of France. We asked the French ambassador, Francois Delattre, whether they were sort of teetering as to whether to support the UK calls, and they were very sort of vague in their responses. The Trump administration really took everybody by surprise by saying that they were that they basically were pleased with the role that Khalifa Haftar was playing in the country. So there's a great deal of confusion. In addition to that, you have the A3 group, the three African countries that are saying everybody needs to back off a little bit in terms of the international response and let the African Union and the African Union Peace and Security Council lead on this. I think there's a hangover from 2011 where the Africans feel that one South Africa who was on the council at the time had acquiesced to the no-fly zone, that they then went too far in terms of protection of civilians.
Yeah. You're referring to the 2011 Security Council resolution authorizing international intervention in Libya. South Africa was on the Security Council at the time, but if I recall, they abstained from the resolution.
No, they did not.
Oh, they did not. They voted. They backed it. Okay.
South
I think
Africa,
it was like Germany was on the council and abstained or something.
I can't remember the other members. So the Africans feel particularly invested in how this crisis is resolved. And so there's very much a request, if we can, for use of a better word, of the international community to let Africa lead on this. And there was a troika, I think they called it the AU Troika on Libya, that is represented by the current AU chairperson, which is the president of Egypt, the former AU chairperson, which is Rwanda's President Kagame, and the incoming AU chair, which is going to be South Africa. So this troika went to Libya. And really, I think the call from the African Union is that this troika take the lead on resolving the process moving forward.
So let's move elsewhere in Northern Africa to Western Sahara, where I guess it was almost there are similarities in that the trajectory of the conflict seemed to be moving in a positive direction. But now it was hit by a sudden variable. In this case, the UN's Special Envoy Representative, the Secretary General's Special Representative, Horst Kohler, former German president, resigned suddenly. Before we sort of get into sort of the current state of play of Western Sahara at the UN, could you just very briefly sort of give listeners a background on the conflict?
Sure. I mean, I don't know if I would do as good a job as perhaps a historian, but certainly there was a conflict after the Spanish, which was the colonizer in that region in Western Sahara, pulled out. The certain what Morocco calls its southern provinces, what the Polisario calls Western Sahara, they annexed those provinces and have invested billions and billions of dollars trying to get to the minerals and the fisheries that surround that area. And so in 1991, the Security Council passed a resolution to create a UN peacekeeping mission there. And the UN peacekeeping mission is called something to do with the referendum in Western Sahara. The point of that mission was to allow an independence referendum that would determine the future of that territory. Of course, that was 1991. We are decades later, and the conflict has not been resolved. So we're at a point now where there's a great deal of frustration, I think particularly from, penholder the United States, that this process has not moved as quickly as they might have hoped. So they have been pushing for the extension of the mandate for not 1 year, but for 6 months, so as to create added impetus to get the parties together. And what Horst Kohler managed to do was to bring these parties together for the first time in Geneva in December last year for face-to-face talks, in addition to the neighbors, Mauritania and Algeria. And this was really seen as a breakthrough moment for this long-standing crisis in terms of really moving the process forward. But as you pointed out, he has now resigned due to health reasons.
So an interesting wrinkle to this story comes in the figure, I think, of John Bolton. So back in 1991, he was an aide to James Baker and was the guy who really sort of helped set the conditions for that peacekeeping operation to launch. And, I've been sort of studying John Bolton for years, and, he has a couple of sort of fixations that are non-conventional, you might say. One of them, you could say, is the International Criminal Court. The other is certainly Western Sahara. I saw a quote that he gave, I think, to the New Yorker, saying there are two Americans who think about Western Sahara. James Baker is one of them. I'm the other. And if you read his memoir, he just has like a whole chapter of it. It's just like, the amount of attention he gives to it is not commensurate with perhaps the role it plays in international politics, but nonetheless, it's a fixation of his. And so I'm sort of curious to see how sort of the introduction of Bolton as national security advisor about a year and a half ago has impacted sort of the dynamics of the Security Council on this issue.
Well, I do have one anecdote that can sort of speak to how I think John Bolton's role as national security advisor is shaping the debate here. We have seen a shift in the U.S. position to say that Morocco's proposal of giving greater autonomy to the Frente Polisario over that territory, excluding, of course, the option of independence, and with that, very possibly the referendum that the Polisario still wants, the self-determination referendum. The United States is now saying that they believe that the Moroccan proposal has some credibility to it. Now, of course, not everybody around the table agrees that any member state or any country in the Security Council should be putting its finger on the scale in such a way, just as the now departed Horst Kohler was trying to get parties around the table to negotiate an outcome. And so South Africa, for example, was very critical during a recent meeting of the Security Council that certain member states were sort of pronouncing on what they thought was a good idea and what not, and that they felt was undermining the negotiations that needed to happen directly between the two parties.
So, but as you mentioned, one sort of thing that's accompanied Bolton's ascendance is that as opposed to renewing the mandate of the peacekeeping mission for a year, you said it's been only renewed for 6 months, so as to add some like urgency to the negotiations. Theoretically, with the threat that the peacekeeping mission may be pulled, do you think that's an actual possibility or an outcome?
Well, I can quote the Moroccan ambassador Omar Hilal, who talked about called his offer, the offer of the Moroccans, pragmatic and realistic, and he warned the Polisario in a statement to journalists during the last meeting of the council that offering their people the myth of independence was not going to alleviate their pain. So he calls it a myth of independence. I don't think the Moroccans are on board. In terms of a self-determination referendum, they believe that the only offer on the table in these negotiations is the greater autonomy of those provinces, what they call their southern provinces, under the Polisario front. But sovereignty, complete sovereignty or independence is not one of those options. So it does raise questions about what they had hoped to achieve in the negotiations if they started them with such very firm positions or conditions, if you will.
So, as we're speaking, the number of people killed by this Ebola outbreak in DRC has exceeded, I think, 1,200. It's the second worst Ebola outbreak of all time, the worst to hit the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is no stranger to Ebola outbreaks. I'm curious to learn from you how this outbreak is playing in the halls of the UN in New York. I mean, do you see any similarities to how diplomats are talking about this outbreak to the West Africa outbreak of several years ago, which was, I suppose, far more international This current outbreak has not crossed any borders that we know of just yet. But what's sort of like the buzz on this Ebola outbreak that seems to be unrelenting right now?
Well, I'll tell you, the buzz is that there is no buzz. Certainly, if you were to compare it to the response we saw in 2014 through 2016, and the 11,000 people died in that West Africa outbreak. So if you compare sort of the death toll right now, you go, well, clearly this is not on the same level. But I also think there was a miscalculation on the international community's part, because the DRC was historically very good at dealing with Ebola outbreaks. So that's not to say that there weren't warnings and pointing to the fact that this outbreak is happening in the Ituri region and the North Kivu region. So for people who don't know, that's East DRC. That's in the borders of Burundi, Uganda, Rwanda, that kind of region, which is known for its hostility, it's known for its insecurity, and its plethora of armed groups, including the Allied Democratic Forces, the ADF, which is the sort of group that fled Uganda back in the day. And so this is a known to be a very insecure area, and so there've been attacks by these armed groups against peacekeepers trying to secure the health facilities that have been set up to deal with the Ebola outbreak. But in addition to that, Mark, and similarly to what we saw in West Africa, there's a lack of education and understanding about what Ebola is and what the types of death sentences that it hands out, whether the body you are dealing with is deceased or not. And so in terms of burial rites and people's local traditions, You've had the United Nations and the World Health Organization and various other aid organizations go in there and try to teach people that perhaps they shouldn't wash the bodies, for example, before they bury it, shouldn't touch the body. That's something that does not resonate. And so you've seen a lack of understanding and pushback from local communities that have raided some of the health centers, that have killed some of the health professionals working there. And what we're now seeing from the UN and the WHO is that they need to strengthen the leadership team there. They've appointed a guy called David Gressley, who's an American. He's the former SRSG, the special representative to the Secretary General, the former deputy in the DRC, so he has an understanding of the region. But it remains to be seen how quickly now, with this new sort of posture, the UN can really arrest what really has surprised everybody, given the longevity, 10 months now, of this outbreak. But as I say, very, very complicated area, very, very rural part of the DRC, thick forests. They suspended the elections in that area because of the Ebola outbreak and the insecurity that region posed. So it's a very, very complex area in which to secure and deal with Ebola comprehensively.
It's interesting, though, to hear from you that there's no real talk of any sort of action at like the Security Council level, or sort of maybe sub-Security Council level of sort of addressing this issue, at least compared to, in 2014 when, there was a Security Council resolution created, like a UN body, I think it was called like UNMI, the UN Mission for Ebola or something like that for West Africa. But there's no, even as this problem continues to metastasize, there just isn't that sort of level of focus, at least yet.
I think, and I think you make a broader point that speaks to the fact that the UN Security Council is dealing with a lot of big crises at the same time. There was an expectation, if we just dip back to Libya for a minute, there was an expectation from the Secretary General over a year ago, Mark, where he told a group of journalists that he met over lunch. We asked him, what do you, SG, believe is going to be the one crisis that you are going to be able to deal with, certainly in the short to medium term? What's the one thing you're going to be able to say, this is what we did and this is how we fixed it? And he said Libya. He said Libya gives him hope. He really feels that Libya is going to give the UN a win in that sense. And that, of course, is also not proven to be true. So I think they're trying, the tentacles of the Security Council is literally everywhere, whether you're talking about South Sudan, the DRC, Mali, Central African Republic. I mean, there's a lot going on just in that Central African region anyway. And so when you say that, well, perhaps they're not giving the focus to Ebola that it needs, just too many things going on, and they are very distracted.
So speaking about a huge, I don't know if you want to call it a distraction, but a big event looming in the near future, potentially at least, is the Middle East peace plan. You and I were chatting a little before we recorded, and you suggested that sort of the rollout of this Middle East peace plan, probably in June, will really take up a lot of oxygen around Turtle Bay. So can you just sort of, we don't know exactly what's in the plan. We've heard some bits and pieces of it, but how do you think the rollout of this plan might affect diplomacy around the UN in the coming months?
I mean, I don't think it's going to help. Let's put it that way. This is they talked now for a very long time. Everybody's been asking for most of this year, because initially the idea was that it was going to come out at the beginning of 2019. It's been delayed. So there's a great deal of expectation. I mean, you even ask close allies of the United States on the Security Council, what have you heard? And they say, we haven't seen anything and we know nothing. We know what you know. So that's a clear sign of how tightly held this peace plan has been to the chests of Jared Kushner and the Israeli envoy to that region. So what are the expectations? They seem to want to kick this off with an economic conference in Bahrain, which the Palestinians have said they are not going to. The Palestinian prime minister over the weekend tweeted that they'd managed to convince China and Russia not to attend as well. There just isn't enough goodwill between the Palestinians and the United States right at this moment. And we can point to a number of things, whether it's the unilateral decision as it pertains to the status of Jerusalem. The United States recently calling for UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinians, essentially that has been helping Palestinian refugees over the decades, to be shut down. Closing the quasi-embassy, the PLO's offices in D.C., the warm embrace of Donald Trump to Prime Minister Netanyahu, who, despite his violations of various Security Council resolutions as it relates to settlements, there's just not enough trust between the Palestinians and the United States right now. They do not see Washington as an honest broker. And I think the facts speak for themselves.
Yeah, I don't know what's in the plan, obviously, but I could guess that what is in the plan will be something that is overwhelmingly what the government of Israel supports. Just seeing how the alliances between the Trump administration and the Netanyahu administration have, become so ensconced and close over the last, several years. And I can only imagine that will add to further divisions, at the UN.
You'll also remember, Mark, the statement a year or two ago where Trump basically wavered between two-state solution, one-state solution, and eventually he retracted and said, he's for what both parties basically decide. I mean, the fundamental principle of the international community, the United Nations, the Security Council in particular, has been the affirmation of a trajectory towards a two-state solution. So now you're hearing one state solution possibly. Does that mean a different set of rights for Palestinians in what the Israelis call a Jewish state? How's that going to work? What is the United States? You talk about them favoring Israel possibly in a new plan. How then do you acquiesce the other side? Is it going to be a huge economic Marshall Plan type pronouncement in terms of giving the Palestinians financial support that they just cannot refuse? But if you look at the history of these negotiations, I think that the economic angle has been tried with Palestinians before. But what the Palestinians are clear on is they want their independence, they want their own government in place, and they want to be able to do things their way. And I'm not hearing enough about a two-state solution. Certainly not from the Israelis, because remember, the Netanyahu used that as a plank. Just before the most recent Israeli elections, he talked about a one-state solution. So I don't know. Where do we go from there,
Yeah, well, I think you and I, if we had just 20 more minutes, could probably solve this.
You're far too optimistic.
All right. So speaking of global diplomats, so 2 years into his term now is Antonio Guterres, almost 2 years. What's your assessment? I mean, you've been at the UN for a long time. What's your assessment now of how he has conducted himself in his role?
There's no question that Antonio Guterres is clearly a seasoned international bureaucrat, diplomat, call him what you will. He understands the issues. A council ambassador, just as the Libya crisis was unfolding, and he'd returned from Libya, briefed them. This ambassador said to us that he walked in there without any notes, and he sat down and he explained everything in granular detail for about 3 hours. Without needing pen and paper, he just really understands the issue. The concern, certainly, I think, from colleagues in the International Press Corps here is that he's not able to translate that granular knowledge into great and sound bites that can really show leadership at the United Nations. Whenever there's a crisis, whether it's on climate change or certain actions by a member state as it regards to what is really a fundamental cornerstone of Secretary General's agenda has been the climate change issue. They still are not able. When the United States, for example, withdrew from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, there's a real lack of ability, enthusiasm, the ability to criticize bad actors in the world today. And I think that has to do with the threats of, funding for, the U.S. being the largest funder, the strength of the oil billions in the Middle East as it pertains to Saudi Arabia. Even after the Jamal Khashoggi murder in the consulate in Turkey, there was just a lack of will from UN officials to stand in front of a microphone and speak truth to power. So, there's definitely a disconnect between what happens, I think, behind the scenes and perhaps the frank conversation he's able to have or the quiet diplomacy he's engaged in rather than what we see from Antonio Guterres, certainly when there's a microphone in his face.
That's interesting to see to see that disconnect, though, and compare it to his predecessor who, did not have like the kind of diplomatic, perhaps, finesse that Antonio Guterres has.
Well, I think he also, Ban Ki-moon, to his credit, had this was not his first language. He learned English on the job. If you talk to colleagues that we hear, when he was appointed, he didn't speak. He wasn't very confident in one of the official languages of the UN. And so he got better over time, but he wasn't a combative individual to begin with. Yeah. Guterres shows you that he's very powerful in his understanding of the issues, and he's a very strong orator. I mean, he can speak his mind if he wants to. I know that for a fact. It's just there seems to be a reluctance or an ability to criticize even when you know that you're right. And that's got to do, I think, with trying to save jobs and not wanting to lose funding. Because, this is people's livelihoods. And that's something we don't discuss enough, is the people that work at the UN could lose their jobs if funding dries up. So, it's a balancing act, if you will.
Finally, if you have a couple more minutes, I'd love to chat with you about South Africa. You are, of course, a journalist from the South African Broadcasting Corporation. South Africa is on the Security Council as a rotating member. I guess I'm curious to learn from you, sort of your perspective as a South African covering the UN. What sort of is most relevant to you in the stories that you're looking to bring to your audience in South Africa? I know a lot of what you do is the same kind of stuff that any other sort of wire service would do, but but a certain portion has to be sort of just kind of unique and focused on South Africa. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. The reason we opened up an office at the United Nations is because we were so dependent on the Western media and the Western wires, for you all. So a lot of stories would focus on quotes from the P3 or the P5, but very much with a sort of Western slant. And so we took a decision years ago that we needed a bureau so that we could better reflect the African perspectives on 75% of what it is the Security Council is discussing, which is Africa. Yeah. So I think the big story, for members of the developing world, whether you're talking from China down, is there's a recognition, and I think more so than you find in the Western world, that the Security Council is and the UN more broadly is in desperate need of reform. Now, this is probably something you've heard many, many times before. But if you look at the veto and how destructive the veto has been, Mark, whether you look at Syria, whether you look at the Palestinian issue, whether you look at the threat of the veto in terms of Western Sahara, the veto has prevented the international community from dealing and solving some of the most protracted conflicts in the world. And I think that has been very frustrating to African countries, particularly countries like South Africa, who feel that they want to punch above their weight. I mean, South Africa is the most developed economy in Africa. It's had nice Nelson Mandela as an icon. Look what the world did to help South Africa move through apartheid, so they now feel they want to give back. But unfortunately, no matter how much enthusiasm, how much positive energy you bring to any debate in the Security Council, if you do not change the power dynamics in that council, we are going to go around in circles forever.
And so a lot of your reporting is focusing on that issue, on sort of the relevance. Yeah,
we report the news, but I think you cannot avoid the fact that when you discuss Syria or when you discuss the Palestinian issue, that you do not address the fact that this council is not reformed, and that often the national interests of P5 members determine what gets done and what not. And that is a structure that will fundamentally have to change if the world recognizes that that we need to move forward in terms of the various crises around the world. The veto is a very, very destructive force, and I don't think it gets enough attention in the Western media.
Well, Sherwin, thank you so much for your time. Do you feel like we covered a lot of ground here? Anything else you want to plug before we sign off?
If you're happy, I'm happy.
I'm happy. Thank you. And thank you so much for your reporting and for your work. I love following your work. So thank you.
I look forward to meeting you one day.
Yes, it'll happen.
All right. Cheers, mate.
Bye.
Take care. Ciao.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Sherwin. That was really interesting. I appreciated that little bit at the end about South African perspectives on the Security Council and the need for UN Security Council reform. At some point, we should devote like a whole podcast to Security Council reform. We could totally nerd out. All right. We'll see you next time. Bye.